Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook, and today we are talking about politics and economics in Latin America from 1821 through 1880. This is materials taken from Chapter 9 of Martin and Wasserman's book, Latin America and Its People. So let us begin. So after the wars of independence, the new nations of Latin America confronted several enormous challenges. One challenge was the need to take such a diverse population of diverse racially, ethnically, socially, to create out of Indians, mestizos, mulattoes, Creoles, a sense of allegiance to a nation state as opposed to an empire or a locality. The second challenge was to rebuild their economies following almost over 20 years of prolonged wars of independence, and in many cases their economies were completely devastated. Before they could undertake these efforts, they had to resolve endless disputes over what type of government they were going to have. After 300 years of rule by the Spanish Empire and the Spanish monarchy, particularly, and in the case of Brazil, the Portuguese monarchy, this was a hot issue. In this issue of governance the problems were regionalism and divisions. Divisions were class-based, ethnic, geographic. People of different social classes fought for control of the new governments. Underlying the politics was a deep fear that the white upper classes had of the lower classes, African Latin Americans, native peoples, and mixed bloods. So the question that many were asking themselves is who should govern and what type of government. Most Latin Americans chose the Republican model of government, with political participation limited to a literate or landowning male property owners. This was imitating the example of the United States and in some cases France. In many cases they designed their governments with three branches: an executive, legislature, and a judiciary. The leaders that arose to rule in Latin America tended to be charismatic military caudillos. Caudillos were strongmen, military strongmen who took power and ruled autocratically, usually through a process of violent warfare. They bridged the gap between the upper and lower classes. One example would be Argentina's Juan Manuel de Rosas, who was a landowner and wealthy landowner, but he would go out and work with his gauchos, many of whom were mulattoes or mestizos, and he would ride, shoot, and socialize with them. He especially was successful at getting the support of black Argentines, and he was the preeminent example of a military caudillo. Another one was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna in Mexico, who was famous for losing the battles and allowing Texas to become independent. He switched sides between the conservatives and liberals numerous times in Mexican history and ended his career as a bit of a tragic and comic figure. Also in Paraguay, Francisco Solano Lopez was the third in a row of three dictators and was a military caudillo who was in charge of Paraguay during the War of the Triple Alliance. Economies were devastated by the wars, not only the wars of independence, but civil wars that soon followed after that. Some of the issues that had to be decided were whether governments were going to choose a form of governance called centralism or federalism. Federalism being a little bit more like the model of the United States. Also, another decision that had to be made was what role would the Catholic Church play in national politics. This is Francisco Solano Lopez, the narcissistic and paranoid dictator of Paraguay during the War of the Triple Alliance. Both Brazil and Mexico first adopted monarchies. Brazil successfully, and Mexico not so much. Emperor Agustin Primero Iturbide lasted little more than a year in 1821 as the Emperor of Mexico. Mexico did not have a tradition of monarchy ruling in Mexico as Brazil did, and they didn't have what was viewed as a legitimate European monarch as Brazil did. The Brazilian monarchy, however, endured for 67 years, from 1822 to 1889, through the lives of two emperors. Dom Pedro I, from 1821 to 1829, the son of King Juan, and Dom Pedro II, for 1839 through the end of the Brazilian Empire in 1889, when it became a republic. A political hot potato was the issue of federalism versus centralism, which also often aligned itself also with the issue of liberalism versus conservatism. Not in all cases, but in most cases, federalists were liberals and centralists were conservatives. The one exception was in Argentina. Regionalism was at the core of the political discourse with the political ideologies of the times. Privileged groups distrusted the lower groups or lower classes. In the 19th century, the role of the Roman Catholic Church became a controversial issue in the economy and politics. The place of collective landholdings as practiced by Indian and Mestizo villages was important. Indians had traditionally held their ejidos or common agricultural lands not as individuals but as a village, and this clashed with liberal ideology and free trade. Another issue was free trade or protectionism. As we'll see, these are not as simple as they might seem. In the area of political philosophy, liberalism versus conservatism, regional elites tended to be liberals in order to maintain their traditional autonomy. The merchants were also more likely to be liberal because they favored deregulation of commerce and laissez-faire free market policies. Liberals discovered that economic development was incompatible with federalism. So some of them became centralists so that they could impose a more liberal economic system on their country. Free trade did help industrial development. Conservatives fought most fiercely for the rights and privileges of the church, which they believed served as the protector of social stability. Conservatives also tended to be pro-military, pro-tradition. Geography also played a decisive role in this process of national unification. Many countries were divided by mountain chains, deserts, and jungles, which often impeded easy overland transportation and communication. It made it difficult to determine clear national and provincial boundaries. One example might be where Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia and Brazil all come together in the Amazon rainforest. That would be a difficult area to establish clear boundaries. The linguistic differences and racial antagonisms divided many countries as well. And here's a picture of a geographic picture of Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. And you see that in Colombia there's 3 major mountain chains dividing the country, as well as rivers and plains areas and swampy areas close to the Amazon. This challenge of regionalism affected Mexico as well, and Central America, in addition to Argentina. All required a series of civil wars to create nations from regional conglomerations. Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay owed their status as separate nations to their efforts to escape from the control of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Brazil avoided the ravages of civil war, but still experienced strong or serious conflicts that were regional in nature. Only Chile did not struggle to unify. For the first 60 years, Chile had a peaceful transition from one president to another. Central Americans struggled against one another and also against Mexico. In the beginning, I'll come back to Mexico in a moment. Argentina, the people of Rio de la Plata struggled among themselves based on regional loyalties. The Unitarios were primarily export-oriented landowners and merchants in Buenos Aires and favored a unified secular nation with an economy based on free trade. They also sought to limit the influence of the church and advocated religious freedom. The Central American nations originally were part of the Empire of Mexico, but separated when Mexico became a republic. They separated from Mexico and then fought among each other for a number of years about whether to be one nation of Central America and eventually became separate countries as opposed to the United States of Central America, as they intended to do at one time. In Mexican politics, there was a constant battle between Centralists and Federalists who alternated in power throughout the, that's supposed to be the 1850s. The first part of the 19th century. Santa Anna began as a Federalist, but switched sides. The loss of Texas and the war with the United States badly discredited Santa Anna and the Centralists. Civil war erupted between the Liberals, who were Federalists, and the Conservatives, who were the Centralists. Benito Juárez led the Liberals to victory over the Conservatives and eventually the French in 1867, and became a national hero. Benito Juárez was a full-blooded Zapotec Indian, a liberal, and is today revered as one of the fathers of Mexican history. This is a mural of Benito Juárez leading the fight against the French with peasants. Upper Peru, which is now known as Bolivia, broke away from Argentina in 1810. Paraguay broke away after 1811 from Buenos Aires. Montevideo, which was across the river in present-day Uruguay, also rejected the rule of Buenos Aires. In 1819, and coastal and interior provinces declared themselves independent republics, each ruled by a local warlord. Regionalism was also a problem in Brazil. It was a particular problem for Dom Pedro I, who was the first emperor of Brazil. Regional leaders never ceased their opposition to Pedro I, and the tax system was set up in such a way that the Rio de Janeiro national or federal government was quite weak. Pedro II became emperor at age 14 and provided a stability and leadership for 60 years. Regionalism determined Brazil's political fate, and Brazil also endured continuous rebellions. There was a century of war. Some scholars attribute the constant warfare in Latin America as one of the primary reasons why Latin America fell behind the United States economically. There were wars of political consolidation, for example, to overthrow Rosas in 1852, 19 civil wars in Colombia in the 19th century. There were civil wars in Central America and with Mexico. There were inter-regional wars, such as the War of the Triple Alliance of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay against Paraguay, and also the War of the Pacific between Chile and Peru. There were also foreign wars, the Mexican War with the United States, and then later the Mexican Civil War, which then turned into a war with the French. The impact of the war was profound, both politically and economically. There was constant warfare with militarized societies, which increased the role of caudillos, and it rubbed raw old ethnic and class divisions. There's a map showing some of the warfare between the United States and Mexico. Popular participation was an important issue that we won't have time to talk about in this session, so I will go on and see if I can get to the conclusion. Let me back up one. The 19th century was very difficult in Latin America. There was a great deal of instability, such as in Mexico, Argentina, Colombia. Peru was probably the worst case scenario, 24 regime changes and 30 presidents. However, there was a high participation for lower classes. The military provided upward mobility, and the post-independence Latin America was difficult, but common people had some degree of control. we will continue with Chapter 10. Thank you.